Listen, there is a space between the last breath of day and the first silence of night. A threshold. Welcome to DreamTales Africa, where ancient African tales, dark folklore, and haunting myths come alive. In my village, we have always known that this is when the veil is at its thinnest, when a whisper can carry further than it should, when a shadow can detach itself from the trunk of the great baobab and walk on its own. We have rituals for this time. Prayers muttered over smoldering herbs, salt scattered at the doorways, the hurried packing of earth. We believe these rituals were a shield, a bulwark against the things that walk when the sun is gone. We were wrong. They are not a shield. They are a suggestion. And on the night they buried Kofi, the other side of that veil declined the suggestion. This is not a ghost story. A ghost is a memory, an imprint of sorrow on the fabric of a place. What returned to us was not a memory. It was a fact. Solid, tangible, unignorable. Its knuckles were not ethereal. They were made of bone and skin, and they struck the wood of Alma's door with a physical force that splintered the paint. The sound did not echo in the ears. It vibrated in the chest, a second, terrible heart beating against the door. They buried him before sunset. This is the absolute truth. I was there. I felt the dry, cool soil fall from my own hands onto the plain wooden coffin. I saw the last sliver of orange sun vanish behind the hills as we padded down the final mound. We performed the act. We said the words. We fulfilled the custom that had been passed down through 1,000 generations, a chain of tradition unbroken until that night. We believed the matter was settled. The body was on the earth. The spirit, we hoped, was on its long journey. We returned to our homes. We lit our lamps. We tried to swallow our supper past the lumps of grief in our throats. We attempted to find solace in the familiar rhythms of the night, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft murmur of conversation from a neighboring compound. But a new tension hung in the air, thick and cold. It was the tension of a story left unfinished, a sentence without a full stop. Alma did not sleep. She sat on the floor of her hut, her back against the wall, still wearing the same dress she had worn at the graveside. The kerosene lamp on the low stool cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the finality of the day. Her tears had dried, leaving salty tracks on her skin, but her body was still shaking with the aftershocks of a pain so profound it had no sound. She was listening, not to the night, but to the silence Kofi had left behind. It was a silence that had a weight, a presence. It was a listening silence. And then, the silence broke. It was not a loud sound at first, not a bang. It was a knock, a single, deliberate, percussive tap on her door. Solid, unmistakable. In a village like ours, a knock in the night is not unusual. A neighbor in need, a child with a fever. But this knock, this was different. It carried a quality that froze the blood in her veins. It was not a request for entry. It was an announcement, a statement of arrival. Her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, fixed on the door. The world had shrunk to that single rectangle of wood. It came again. Knock. Louder this time. More insistent. The wood of the door groaned in its frame. A part of her mind, the rational part that still clung to the world of the living, scrambled for an explanation. It's Jabari, she thought. He has come to offer comfort, to press his advantage in her moment of ultimate vulnerability. It's one of the elders. It's a dream. But her body, her ancient, instinctual body, knew better. Her skin prickled with a cold that had nothing to do with the night air. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. Knock. The third knock was not just a sound. It was a force. It was the sound of bone meeting wood with an intent that transcended mere physics. It was the sound of a barrier being tested and failing. Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Alma pushed herself to her feet. Her legs felt boneless. The few steps to the door seemed like a mile. The packed earth floor was cold beneath her bare feet. The lamplight flickered, and the shadows leaped and twisted, forming shapes that teased the corners of her vision. A familiar slope of a shoulder, the curve of a head she knew as well as her own. She stopped before the door. She could feel a presence on the other side, a profound stillness that was the opposite of the empty night. This was a focused, patient, waiting stillness. It had mass. It had weight. It had a name. Her hand, trembling violently, rose towards the wooden bolt. Her fingers, slick with a cold sweat, brushed against the rough-hewn wood. Every cell in her body screamed at her to stop, to run, to hide in the darkest corner of her hut. But another part, a part forged in love and a desperate, impossible hope, compelled her forward. What if? The thought was too terrible, too beautiful, to complete. She slid the bolt back. The sound was obscenely loud in the hush. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the last breath of her old life, and pulled the door open. The figure that stood there was silhouetted against the deep indigo of the pre-dawn sky. It was tall. It was broad-shouldered. It wore the same simple white burial tunic in which they had wrapped him. The cloth was clean, unstained by the soil of the grave. He stood there, solid and real as the earth itself. He did not speak. He did not need to. The air around him was thick with a silence that was his own. He simply stood, his face in shadow, his presence an impossible fact in her doorway. This is where the story truly begins. Not with the knocking, but with the opening of the door. Not with the return, but with the confrontation of the returned. To understand how such a thing could happen, how the iron laws of life and death could be so utterly suspended, you must go back. Back to the beginning. Back to the sunlight and the laughter. Back to the two men, one of life and one of death, and the woman whose love became the axis upon which our world turned. You must understand who Kofi was. Not the silent figure at the door, but the man whose laughter could fill a clearing. You must understand the depth of Alma's love, a love so strong it might have been the very thread his soul used to find its way back. And you must understand Jabari, the architect of the tragedy, the man who set this terrible wheel in motion with the poison of his envy. This is the testimony of a village that learned, too late, that some debts are collected not in this world or the next, but in the terrible, silent space between them. This is the story of the day we buried Kofi before sunset, and the night he decided to come home. The door was open. The world stood still. The dawn wind, which usually carried the scent of dew and waking flowers, now brought only a chill, a dry, ancient cold that smelled of turned earth and deep, shadowed places where sunlight never reached. And he stood within the frame of the door, a monument of silence. Alma's breath plumed in the sudden frost that seemed to emanate from him. Her eyes, wide and uncomprehending, scanned the figure. This was Kofi. It was the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the curve of his lips. But it was Kofi rendered in marble, in ice, in wood. The vibrant, sun-warmed hue of his skin was now pale, almost ashen, like the moon on a misty night. His eyes, which had once sparkled with mischief and burned with passion, were now still, terribly still. They were not the eyes of a dead man. They were not clouded or vacant. They were the eyes of the ancient forest pool, deep, unblinking, holding secrets and reflections of a world not our own. They held no recognition, no love, no anger. Just observation. A patient, endless observation. He did not move to enter. He simply stood, his presence an anchor dragging the real world into the depths of the impossible. Kofi. The name was a torn whisper from Alma's lips, a fragile thing that threatened to shatter in the cold air. His head tilted, a minute, mechanical motion. The movement was not his own. It was the movement of a puppet whose strings were being pulled by an unseen hand. His lips, pale and dry, parted. The voice that emerged was not the rich, melodious baritone that had sung her to sleep on countless nights. It was a dry rustle, the sound of dead leaves scraping across hard ground, the sound of roots shifting deep underground. It was the voice of the earth. You buried me too soon. The words were not an accusation. They were not a lament. They were a statement of fact, a correction, a chronological error being pointed out by a force that existed outside of time. He took a single step forward. Alma stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth. As he moved into the lamplight, she saw the fine, dark soil that clung to his burial tunic, that was dusted in his hair, that lay in the creases of his neck. It was the soil from his own grave. He walked past her, into the center of her hut. His movements were fluid but weighty, each footfall landing with a soft, final sound, as if he carried the mass of the entire world upon his shoulders. He did not look at her again. He went and stood in the corner, where the shadows were deepest, and he became still once more, a statue in a shrine of grief. This was the beginning of the long, slow unraveling of our world. The news did not travel by word of mouth. It traveled by a tremor in the air, a collective shiver that ran through the village as the sun finally crested the horizon. It was in the way the birds fell silent. It was in the unnatural quiet that blanketed the compounds. People emerged from their huts, their faces drawn with a shared, unspoken dread. They gathered in small, whispering clusters, their eyes darting towards Alma's home. I was among them. I saw Nana Surwa, the oldest of us, standing at her doorway, her gnarled hand gripping her staff so tightly her knuckles were white. She was looking not at Alma's hut, but at the sacred forest. Her lips were moving in a silent, urgent prayer. "He is here," was all Alma could say to the first brave souls who approached her door. Her face was a mask of terrified confusion. "He is here, and he is cold." The village's dilemma was not a simple question of ghost or no ghost. We know ghosts. We have our Sasabonsum, our trickster spirits, the echoes of unhappy ancestors. They are things of mist and memory. They flicker at the edge of vision. They whisper. They cause chills and misfortune. This was different. This was a fact. Kofi was as solid as you or I. A child could have touched him. A dog, later that day, did approach him, sniffing the air, and let out a low, terrified whine before tucking its tail and fleeing. A sound none of us had ever heard from the brave creature. This was a paradox that cracked the foundation of our understanding. How could a man be dead and buried, and yet stand among us, his body whole, his heart silent, his lungs still? The elders, led by Nana Kwaku, convened in the village square. The air was thick with fear, a metallic taste on the tongue. "It is an Abayafo," one man insisted, his voice trembling. "A witch has animated his body to walk and bring us ruin." "No," countered another. "It is his own spirit, too strong to be contained by the earth. He has unfinished business, a grievance." Nana Kwaku listened to it all, his ancient eyes closed, his fingers steepled. Finally, he spoke, his voice raspy with a weariness that went beyond a single sleepless night. "We do not know what it is, but we know the customs. We must cleanse. We must fortify the village. We must persuade his spirit to continue its journey." And so, the rituals began. That first evening, as the sun bled once more into the horizon, the entire village gathered at the perimeter. The elders, clad in their traditional white robes, carried pots of sacred herbs and bowls of water fetched from the 7 streams that fed our land. They chanted the old words, the words meant to strengthen the veil, to reassure the spirits of the dead that their path lay ahead, not behind. They sprinkled the water, they scattered the herbs. The smoke from their censers curled into the twilight, carrying our prayers to the heavens. From the doorway of Alma's hut, Kofi watched. He had not moved from his corner all day, but as the chanting reached its peak, he took a single step forward, just to the threshold. He did not cross it. He simply stood there, a silent, solid rebuttal to every word being chanted. The moment the elder's holy water was sprinkled in his direction, a strange thing happened. The water did not sizzle or evaporate as it would on a demon. It simply stopped, a hand's breadth from his tunic, and fell to the ground, as if it had hit an invisible glass wall. The chanting faltered. The ritual, our first and strongest defense, had failed. It was like trying to extinguish a forest fire with a cup of water. His presence was a truth that our traditions could not wash away. Panic, cold and sharp, began to dig its claws into the heart of the village. People barred their doors with heavier wood. They painted protective symbols with Insurama ink on their doorposts. They refused to walk alone after dark. The vibrant life of our community began to wither under the shadow of this silent, unmoving man in Alma's hut. But Alma's journey was different. The initial, primal terror began to subside, replaced by a gnawing, desperate curiosity. This was Kofi, her Kofi, the man whose body she had known, whose mind she had loved. While the village saw a monster, she began to see patterns. She noticed that he never ate. He never drank. He never slept. He simply stood, or sometimes sat, his stillness absolute. But his eyes were not entirely vacant. They would sometimes move, with a slow, deliberate grace, to settle on certain objects. They would linger on the wooden comb he had carved for her, its handle shaped like a soaring bird. They would rest on the low stool he had made for her father, its legs carved with the twisting form of the river god. And one afternoon, as the sun was high, a group of children, emboldened by the daylight, dared to run past Alma's compound, laughing and shouting. At the sound of their carefree voices, Kofi, who had been standing like a sentinel, turned his head. It was the most human gesture Alma had witnessed since his return. His gaze followed the children, and for a fleeting second, a fraction of a heartbeat, Alma saw it. A deep, bottomless sorrow in the depths of those still, pool-like eyes. A sorrow so vast it could have drowned the world. And then it was gone, replaced once more by the ancient stillness. It was at that moment that Alma understood. This was not random. This was not a curse or a mindless haunting. He was here for a purpose. He was a vessel, and that vessel was waiting to be filled with something. An answer. A truth. She began her investigation not as a hunter stalks prey, but as a scholar deciphers a forgotten text. She started talking to him, not expecting an answer, but speaking about the memories they shared. She told him about the day they first met, by the river where she sang. She spoke of the time he tried to climb the great baobab to fetch a kite for a child and got stuck. She reminded him of the silly songs he would make up while he worked. He gave no sign of hearing, but she persisted. She was piecing him back together, not with magic, but with memory, rebuilding the man around the silent, cold statue that had taken his place. She then turned her attention to his workshop. It had been left untouched since his death, a sacred space of dust and memories. She pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The air inside was thick with the scent of cedar, ebony, and abandonment. His tools lay where he had left them, waiting for a hand that would never return. Half-finished carvings sat on benches, their stories forever untold. She walked through the space, her fingers trailing through the dust on his workbench. She felt his presence here more strongly than in the hut where his body stood. This was where his soul had lived. She opened a small, lidded basket where he kept his most precious pieces, the ones he was still perfecting. And there, wrapped in a soft piece of antelope hide, was the mask. It was carved from the heart of the sacred ebony, so black it seemed to drink the light from the room. It was unfinished, but its power was already palpable. It was not a human face, nor was it an animal's. It was something in between. The lines were severe, angular. The eyes were slanted, knowing. The mouth was a firm, unsmiling line. It was a mask of judgment, of truth. As her fingers closed around the cool, dense wood, a jolt, like a lightning strike, went through her. The world fell away. She is no longer in the workshop. The air is cool, green, and heavy. She is in the forest, the sacred grove. She sees Kofi, his back to her, his axe resting against the terrifyingly beautiful ebony tree. He is triumphant, his hand resting on the log he has taken. Then, a shift in the light. Shadows detach themselves from the trees. Jabari steps forward, the modern rifle looking obscene and out of place in this ancient setting. His face is not one of anger, but of cold, calculating removal, like a man about to dispose of a troublesome insect. She sees the conversation, the cruel smile on Jabari's lips. She sees the struggle, the brief, violent tussle, the loud, sacrilegious crack of the gunshot. Kofi falling, the blood, shockingly red against the black wood and the green moss. He is on the ground, breathing in ragged, wet gasps. Jabari looks down at him, his work done, and then he and his shadows melt back into the forest. And then she is there, her younger self, rushing to his side. She sees herself cradling him. She sees the love and the terror on her own face. She leans close, and this time she hears it. Not the muffled, dying whisper, but the clear, desperate, final truth forced from his lips with his last breath. It was not the forest, a cough, a spray of blood. His eyes lock with hers, pouring all his remaining life into this one message. It was Jabari. Amma gasped, stumbling back, the mask falling from her hands and clattering onto the workbench. She was back in the workshop, her heart hammering against her ribs, the vision seared into her mind with the clarity of the noonday sun. The truth. It had been there all along, buried with him, whispered into her ear but drowned out by her grief. He had told her. With his last living effort, he had named his murderer. The purpose of his return was now horrifyingly clear. He was not an agent of vengeance. The forest, the great, silent witness, had been defiled. Its sacred tree had been used not for a blessing, but as the backdrop for a cowardly murder. The forest, in its ancient, impersonal justice, would not stand for it. It had caught the last spark of Kofi's life, the energy that was trapped between the violence of his death and the haste of his burial, a soul caught in the doorway, unable to move on. It had used that energy, that lingering connection to the world of the living, to send him back. He was a vessel for the truth, a walking, silent testimony. His knocking was not a threat. It was an appeal for the truth to be spoken aloud, for the balance to be restored. He was the forest's evidence. While Amma was uncovering the truth, Jabari was constructing his own prison. His initial, smug confidence had curdled into a thick, cloying fear. He had expected a ghost, a thing to be warded off with charms and prayers. He had not expected this solid, undeniable fact that refused to disappear. He saw the way Amma was changing, her grief hardening into a sharp, focused resolve. He saw the way the village's fear was beginning to be punctuated by curious glances in his direction. He began to campaign. He moved through the village, no longer the generous benefactor, but a man driven by a frantic energy. "This thing is an abomination," he would proclaim to anyone who would listen, his eyes darting nervously. "It is a walking corruption. It will blight our crops, poison our water, steal the breath from our children as they sleep. We cannot reason with it. We cannot cleanse it. We must destroy it." He proposed burning the body. He suggested taking it deep into the forest and abandoning it. He even offered to pay a group of young men from a neighboring village, men who did not know Kofi, to do the deed. But the village, though terrified, was not foolish. To destroy a body that had returned from the grave was to invite a curse of unimaginable proportions. Nana Kwaku refused. "We do not understand what he is, Jabari. To act in ignorance is to pour palm wine on a fire. We will wait. We will watch." Jabari's frustration turned to rage. His polished veneer cracked. He was seen drinking palm wine in the middle of the day, something he had once mocked as a peasant's habit. He shouted at children who played too close to his compound. He accused the elders of being weak, of clinging to outdated superstitions. The very community he had sought to dominate was now closing ranks against him, repelled by his desperation. The rift was growing, and Amma stood on the other side of it, her evidence gathering like a storm. The climax arrived on the 7th day. It was the day of the weekly market, when the entire village and people from neighboring hamlets would gather in the square to trade goods and news. The air should have been filled with the buzz of commerce and lively conversation. Instead, a tense, expectant hush had fallen. Everyone felt it. Something was about to break. Amma emerged from her hut. She was not dressed in the clothes of mourning. She wore a simple, clean dress, and her head was held high. In her hands, she carried the unfinished ebony mask, and behind her, moving with that same, slow, deliberate grace, was Kofi. He followed her like a solemn guardian, his stillness a stark contrast to the agitated energy of the crowd. A path cleared before them as they walked to the center of the square. All eyes were upon them. Jabari, who had been haggling over the price of a bolt of cloth, froze, his face draining of all color. Amma stopped and turned to face the assembly. Her voice, when she spoke, did not tremble. It was clear and strong, carrying to the farthest corners of the square. People of Aquapum, she began. For 7 days, a mystery has lived among us. We have feared it. We have prayed against it. We have called it a monster. But I stand before you today to tell you that we were wrong. What stands behind me is not a monster. It is a message from the sacred forest itself. She held up the ebony mask. The blackwood seemed to absorb the sunlight. This is the mask Kofi was carving from the sacred tree, the mask that broke the taboo. But the forest was not angered by the cutting of the tree. It was angered by the blood that was spilled upon its roots, the blood of an innocent man. She turned her gaze, sharp and unflinching, towards Jabari. He told me. With his last living breath, he named his killer. I was too lost in grief to hear it clearly. But the forest heard, and it has sent him back to us so that all of you, can hear it now. Jabari took a step back, his hands raised. This is madness. She is grief-stricken. The thing has poisoned her mind. Has it, Jabari? Amma's voice was like a whip crack. Then tell us. Tell us why you were seen loading your hunting rifle that morning. Tell us why you and your cousins slipped into the forest from the western path, not the hunter's trail. Tell us why you have been so desperate to burn the evidence of your crime. The crowd murmured, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Jabari's lies were unraveling in the face of Amma's calm, relentless truth-telling. He was a fool. Jabari screamed, his composure shattering completely. The greedy, envious man was finally fully exposed. A proud, stubborn fool standing in the way of progress. He thought his little carvings were more important than my business, my future. He thought he deserved Amma, a man who plays with sticks. I offered him a place in my enterprise, and he spat on it. He had to be removed. It was just business. The word hung in the air, ugly and foreign. Business. He had confessed. He had traded a life for his ambition. The village stared at him, not with anger now, but with a profound, collective pity and revulsion. As the last of his confession faded, a change occurred. Kofi, who had been standing as still as ever, moved. He took a step forward, not towards Jabari, but towards Amma. He stopped before her. The terrible, ancient stillness in his eyes softened. For the first time, he truly looked at her. He saw her. The deep, bottomless sorrow was there, but so was something else. A recognition, a gratitude, a farewell. A single tear, clear and warm, traced a path through the grave dust on Amma's cheek. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Kofi's pale lips. It was a ghost of his old smile, but it was his. At that moment, he was her Kofi again. Then he turned. He walked away from her, away from the square, towards the path that led to the sacred forest. The crowd parted for him, no longer in fear, but in a hushed, awed respect. He did not look back. With every step he took, his form seemed to become less solid, more translucent. The morning sun, now fully risen, shone through him. By the time he reached the tree line, he was made of light and mist. He paused at the edge, the boundary between our world and the deep green of the ancient woods. And then, as a soft breeze rustled the leaves, his form dissolved completely. He scattered like dandelion seeds on the wind, merging back into the earth, into the air, into the spirit of the forest from which he had been borrowed. He was gone. The purpose was fulfilled. The truth had been spoken. Balance was restored. Amma stood in the silent square, the unfinished mask still in her hands. The weight of it was no longer a burden, but a promise. The story was not over. It was just entering its final, quiet act. The dawn that followed the confession was unlike any our village had ever known. It was not the triumphant, golden victory of a battle won, but a quiet, solemn, and deeply cleansing light. It was the light of truth, and truth, we learned, is not always a comfortable thing. It is often a sharp, surgical instrument that cuts away the rot so that healing may begin. The air itself felt washed, scoured clean of the 7 days of fear and the poisonous lie that had festered at its core. The birdsong that returned to the trees seemed more poignant, the colors of the world more vivid, as if we were seeing and hearing it all for the first time, through eyes and ears unclouded by deception. In the center of the village square, where the truth had been dragged kicking and screaming into the light, Jabari stood utterly alone. The confession had ripped away the finely woven cloak of the wealthy, modern trader, leaving exposed the small, envious man beneath. The village did not surround him with angry shouts or raised fists. There was no need. Their silence was a more potent judgment than any mob could ever be. It was a wall of disappointment, of revoked trust, of collective shame that one of their own could have fallen so far from the path of humanity. He was not a villain to be vanquished in a blaze of glory. He was a pitiable lesson in the corruption of the soul. His money, his city influence, his slick words, they were all worthless now, ashes in his mouth. He had sought to possess the village's heart by winning Alma, and in his failure, he had lost his place in the village entirely. The elders would later decide his fate, likely banishment, a fate worse than death in a community where belonging is everything. But in that moment, his punishment was the weight of every averted gaze. But the story's true resolution was not with Jabari. It was with Alma. She stood for a long time in the square after Kofi dissolved into the light, the unfinished ebony mask held firmly in her hands. The crowd eventually dispersed, returning to their homes with hushed, thoughtful voices, each person carrying a piece of the story back to their hearth. But Alma remained. She was the calm, still center around which the universe had realigned itself. Her posture was not one of a grieving lover anymore. The raw, open wound of her sorrow had been sutured by purpose and sealed by truth. What was left was a scar, tough, resilient, and a permanent part of her. She was now the woman who had loved a man so much that his spirit had used that love as a tether to return. She was the woman who had listened when the world was screaming in fear. She was the woman who had deciphered the silent language of the dead. Slowly, deliberately, she turned and walked away from the square. She did not go to her hut, the place that had become a tomb and then a shrine. She walked to the edge of the village, to the very limit where the cultivated land met the untamed wildness of the sacred forest. She stood there, on the threshold, as Kofi had stood on the threshold of her door. The forest loomed before her, no longer a place of terror, but a place of profound, impersonal justice. It was the elder, the judge, the keeper of balances. It had taken her love and, in its own mysterious way, returned him to her, not for her keeping, but for the keeping of a greater order. She looked into the deep green shadows, and she did not see a monster. She saw the memory of a man walking home. She saw the ancient, patient spirit of the trees that had refused to be a silent accomplice to murder. The forest had not been angry. It had been insulted. Its sacred space had been violated by an act of the lowest, most petty human malice. And so, it had acted, not with the hot rage of a man, but with the cold, deliberate force of nature itself. It had used the tools at its disposal, a life cut short, a soul in transition, and the unbreakable thread of a true love. This is the lesson that was woven into the fabric of our village that day, a lesson now whispered to every child cradled in their mother's arms, a lesson etched into the soul of every young person learning their place in the world. The elders, in their wisdom, did not let the event become just a frightening story. They sat with us under the great baobab, and they unpacked its meaning, layer by layer, like the peeling of an onion until the core is revealed. Nana Kwaku, his voice raspy but clear, explained the nature of the two sunsets. There is the sunset you see in the sky, he said, his gnarled finger pointing to the horizon. It is a daily ritual, a beautiful ending. But for the dead, there is another sunset. It happens in the hearts of those who love them. It is the slow, painful setting of their memory, the acceptance of their absence, the gentle closing of the chapter of their life. This sunset cannot be rushed. It takes its own time. We tried to bury Kofi before the first sunset, and we failed. But we also tried to bury him before the second sunset, in our hearts. We tried to pack the earth of forgetfulness over our love for him, to move on too quickly. But a love like that, it has roots that go deeper than any grave. The forest knew this. It knew that the second sunset had not yet occurred in Amma's heart, and so a thread remained. A thread it could use. He then spoke of lies. A lie is not a simple thing, he continued. It is a living entity. When you bury a lie in haste, thinking it is hidden, it does not decompose. It does not return to the earth. Instead, it puts down roots of its own, twisted, poisonous roots, and it grows in the darkness. It feeds on fear and guilt, and eventually, it must break through the surface. It must see the sun. A lie buried in haste will always knock at your door before dawn. It may not wear the face of the dead, but it will knock. In a secret revealed, in a conscience stricken, in a scheme unraveled. Jabari buried his lie with Kofi's body, and it grew in the darkness of his soul for 7 days until it knocked, with the force of a truth that could no longer be contained, on the door of the entire village. And finally, he spoke of Kofi's return. He did not return for love, Nana Kwaku said, and a hush fell over all of us. Nor did he return for hate. If he had returned for love, he would have embraced Amma. He would have spoken her name. If he had returned for hate, he would have strangled Jabari with his bare hands in the night. He did neither. He was an instrument. He returned for balance. The universe, our world, the world of the ancestors and the world of the living, exists in a delicate, sacred balance. When a great wrong is committed, the scales are tipped. An abomination occurs. The forest, as the physical manifestation of that ancient balance, acted to correct the tilt. It used the energy of the wrong, the stolen life, to power the correction. Kofi was the weight placed on the other side of the scale. His presence was a truth so heavy, so undeniable, that it forced the balance to restore itself. In our world, the scales between the living and the ancestors must always be kept even. It is the first law of existence. It is the price of harmony. This understanding transformed the terror of the event into a sacred principle. The story of the knocking was no longer a ghost story to frighten children. It became a foundational myth, a parable of our connection to the natural and spiritual world, a stern warning against the corruption of the individual that threatens the whole. In the weeks and months that followed, life in the village began to find a new rhythm, a new normal, forever marked by what had happened. Amma's role in the community evolved. She was no longer just the singer with the beautiful voice. She was now a repository of hard-won wisdom. Young women and men would come to her, not to hear her sing, but to hear her speak. She became a counselor, a mediator. When disputes arose, people would ask, what would Amma see? What is the truth that is being buried here? She carried the ebony mask with her, a permanent reminder. She never finished carving it. To finish it would be to presume that the story was over, that the lesson was complete. Instead, she kept it in its unfinished state, a symbol that truth is often a work in progress, that justice is not a destination, but a continuous path. She would often be seen, as the sun began to set, walking to the edge of the forest. She would stand there, not in sorrow, but in a kind of silent communication. She was thanking the forest. She was acknowledging its power and its justice. She was assuring it that the lesson had been learned, that the balance was being maintained. Some claimed that on very still evenings, they could see a faint, shimmering outline of a tall, broad-shouldered man standing just inside the tree line, watching over her, a silent guardian ensuring that the peace he had died and returned to secure would not be broken. It was not a frightening sight, but a comforting one. It was the village's protector, a part of the landscape of our lives, as permanent and as reassuring as the great baobab itself. Jabari was banished. He was given a gourd of water and a walking stick and sent away from Aquapum forever. His name was rarely spoken, and when it was not with hatred, but as a cautionary note. Do not be like Jabari, parents would tell their children. Do not let your desires blind you to the balance. His compound was reclaimed by the forest, the thatch rotting, the walls crumbling, a physical manifestation of the fate that awaits a soul untethered from community and truth. The story did not end. It became a part of us. It was woven into our songs. The women composed a new grinding song, its rhythm the steady, patient rhythm of Alma's investigation, its lyrics the story of the two sunsets. The men carved the symbol of the scales into their tools and their doorframes. The children played a new game, not of hunters and animals, but of truth-seekers and silent messengers, their laughter a testament to the fact that even the most terrifying truths, once faced, can be integrated into the joy of life. The moral of the story is not a simple one. It is a complex tapestry of love, loss, justice, and the interconnectedness of all things. It teaches that love is a force so powerful it can bridge the gap between worlds, but that it must ultimately serve a purpose greater than itself. It teaches that the natural world is not a separate resource to be exploited, but a conscious, participating member of our moral universe. It teaches that a community's strength lies not in its wealth or its power, but in its commitment to truth and its courage to face the shadows that knock at its door. And so, the village of Aquapum learned to live with the echo of the knock. It was no longer a sound of dread, but a reminder to speak the truth before it is forced from you, a reminder to let grief run its course, a reminder that every action, every word, every buried lie is a weight upon the great scale of existence. And the forest and the ancestors are always watching, ensuring that balance, in the end, will always be restored. This is the story we tell. This is the wisdom we carry. This is the legacy of Kofi and Alma, a legacy not of death, but of eternal, unwavering balance.